Echoes of the Forgotten Hollow. The day started off great. Two friends, Jake and Ethan, were heading into the woods. This year, everyone was collecting mushrooms. After driving for a couple of hours deeper into the forest, they found a place full of mushrooms. "We've only been walking for a couple of hours, and our baskets are already overflowing," Ethan said. "Yeah," Jake replied, pleased. "I didn't think we'd find so many so quickly. Let's pull up the GPS and head back to the truck." Ethan grabbed his phone and opened the app. The satellite quickly found their location and showed them the way back. The weather was getting worse, the sky filled with gray clouds. "Just what we need, getting caught in the rain," Jake grumbled. "Are we going the right way? This feels like it's taking too long. Don't you agree?" "I have been wondering the same thing," Ethan answered. "But the GPS says we're on track." An hour later, they realized the route was wrong. Rain started drizzling, and the baskets, filled with mushrooms, got heavier with every step. "Let's try rebooting the phone," Jake suggested, sitting down on a stump. Ethan hit the restart button on the phone. The phone buzzed, then went dark. "What is this now?" Ethan said, pointing at the screen. "It won't turn on." "What do you mean it won't turn on? Why not?" Jake asked. "How should I know? It's dead." "Don't worry, just give it a minute and it'll work." But the phone didn't respond, even though he tried to be more forceful. "Okay, Jake, take your phone and call 911 before we get into more trouble. I have no idea which way to go. Where did this GPS even take us?" Jake pulled out his phone and stared at the screen. "No," he said, looking at his friend. "No, what? Look at mine yourself." Jake pushed his phone forward. "Well, this is a mess," Ethan said, breathing out heavily. "Now what? Which way do we go?" "Let's just pick a direction. We can't just stand here." They decided on a path and set off. A light rain fell through the thick branches of the trees, getting stronger. "That's it. I'm tired," Ethan said, sitting down on wet green moss. "How long have we been walking? Do you know?" "I'm not sure," Jake answered. "I don't know. Maybe 4 or 5 hours. I'm soaked through." "Should we stop to figure out how to spend the night? Everything is wet. Starting a fire will not be easy." "I agree. We need a place to camp. Let's move forward a bit to get off this wet moss." Jake led the way. Ethan walked slowly behind. After a few dozen yards, Jake stopped. "Whoa!" he exclaimed. Ethan stopped suddenly too. Before them was an old graveyard. Only a few of the stone markers were still standing. Most of the graves had been flattened over time. Rotting wooden crosses had lost their crossbars, looking like stakes jabbed into the earth. It was a strange sight in the dim evening light. "Look, what is that over there?" Ethan pointed deeper into the cemetery. "Is it an old lady?" "I don't know what to say," Jake replied. "This place is probably 100 years old. What's there to protect?" "Who knows?" Ethan shrugged. "But we don't have any other options. Let's check it out." Walking among the graves felt spooky. Every time a twig snapped under their feet, they flinched and looked around. As they got closer, it became clear that it was not a watchman's shack. An old stone crypt stood among the broken crosses. "It looks like there was probably a village nearby," Ethan said. "Maybe there still is. They buried farmers here, and this crypt might have belonged to their landlord, or whoever was in charge back then. Either way, a cemetery is a good sign." "How so?" Jake asked, confused. "It means a village is close. If anyone is still living there, they can show us the way out. There's no point searching for it now. It'll be dark in these woods in half an hour. We'll crash in the crypt. At least it's a place to stay." "No way," Jake interrupted. "You really want to sleep in a tomb in a cemetery?" "Think about it," Ethan reasoned. "Where else are we going? A night in the woods is no picnic. We're totally drenched. We'll build a fire by the entrance, dry off a bit, and head for the village at dawn. We don't want to get sick." Everyone agreed that it made sense, especially since it was getting colder and the rain was getting stronger. Jake pulled out his phone and flashed the light. They looked around inside the tomb. 2 stone tombs sat in the center. The writing on the stones was illegible. The air was dry. Even though the place felt a bit spooky, it was better than standing around in the rain. "Well," Ethan started, "it's not the best, but it'll do for a night. What do you think? Do you think those crosses outside can be used for firewood?" "They're falling apart anyway," Jake replied. "I doubt anyone would mind." Jake left the crypt. He didn't pull the crosses out of the ground, though. Instead, he walked among the graves and picked up any sticks he found. After a couple of trips, he had collected enough wood to last half the night. 30 minutes later, after struggling with the wet wood, they warmed themselves by the fire. They were tired from their long walk and felt sleepy. They made a simple plan for the next day and finally fell asleep. Jake woke up to a strange noise. He opened his eyes and silently looked around the crypt. The fire had almost gone out. Only a few embers flickered, casting faint light. Jake looked at one of the tombs. Its stone lid was moved. Their equipment was thrown to the floor. He felt sick. He propped himself up on his elbows and looked over where Ethan slept. What he saw shook him to the core. Where his friend had been, a large pool of blood spread out. His eyes were blank as something crouched over him, ripping at his stomach and growling hungrily. Jake felt terrified. His heart pounded. He tried to stand quietly, breathing heavily. A noise behind him caught the thing's attention. It turned just as the last bit of flame went out. Jake screamed and ran to the exit. After 2 jumps, he finally made it outside. He was hit by a wall of freezing rain. He ran without looking, jumping over grave markers. He tripped over a grave marker and lost his balance. He crashed into a mound and hit his head. He lost consciousness. The last thing he saw was a figure resembling a mangled Ethan. Then he was hit by darkness. "You all right?" Jake heard as he came to, jolting upright and scrambling to a corner. Ethan sat in front of him. "What's wrong?" Ethan asked, worried by his friend's panic. "Dude, man," Jake said, looking around the crypt. "How? I saw it. I saw that thing eat you." Like a crazy person, he shouted fragments of what happened. "Who ate me? I chased after you when you tripped," Ethan said. Jake fell silent. His chest moved up and down quickly. He was clearly rattled. "God," he whispered, playing with his hair. "Was it a dream? It felt so real. I saw it. I felt it." "Well, you sure woke me up," Ethan laughed. "Maybe the day's stress got to you. How long was I asleep?" 6 hours, easy," Ethan replied. "You woke up when it was still dark. It's noon now, judging by the sun. While you were asleep, I looked around and found some wild apples. Eat these to relax." He gave Jake a few of the sour apples. "What did you find out there?" Jake asked, chewing, clearly feeling more relaxed after last night. "What about the area?" "I didn't go far. It's too creepy alone. There's a creek to the left with good water. It flows from somewhere, so we will search for a village the other way. We don't want to end up in a swamp." After a while, the guys walked along the edge of the graveyard, moving farther from the crypt. At the cemetery's far end, they stopped before a monument. It stood out because it was the only well-maintained monument in the area. There was a photo on a pyramid-shaped metal frame. A young guy with bright, lively eyes stared out from beyond the photo. He was no older than 20. He had blonde, curly bangs, and he was flashing a mischievous grin, like he was greeting them. "This thing is old. Check the death date. It's from before the war," Ethan said. "But the photo looks fresh. just not in color. I wonder what happened to him, so young, Jake thought out loud, looking at the picture. All right, let's move. Who knows how long it will take to find a town? We've already spent most of the day burning. With that, they continued on. They had not gone far, going through thick bushes or around old pine trees. The sky was low and gray, and it was raining a little, but that didn't make them feel any better. The gloom made everything feel foggy. Both were afraid of the dark. Sleeping outside wasn't appealing. They were hungry, and the wind was cold. They felt hopeless when suddenly the trees parted and they saw an old village. It looked like one of those villages that had been forgotten and left behind. As they walked down a street full of weeds, they looked at old log cabins that had weathered the years. These log cabins were gray and falling apart, with roofs that sagged and windows that were broken. Some of the log cabins had boards covering the windows. The scene was dismal. Well, Jake said, we found a village. Either way, it will be easier to find a way back to civilization from here. Can you check if there's a signal? Ethan asked hopefully. Jake pulled out his phone. There were no bars. Jake shook his head at Ethan. It'll be dark again in a couple of hours, Jake said sadly. What's the plan? Should we stop here or keep looking for a road? I don't know what to do anymore. I don't want to get lost again at night. At that moment, the door of the house they were standing near opened quietly. They quickly turned their heads. An old woman with dark, wrinkled skin stepped onto the porch, staring at them, silently chewing something. Jake snapped out of it first. Hello, he called out loudly. We are lost and stumbled into your village. What can we call you? Folks call me Agnes, she said flatly. Then she turned and walked back inside. The men hesitated. Weird old lady, Jake said. Where did she come from? How is she even surviving? Maybe her family visits from town, Ethan replied. You're thinking about this too much. Let's find out more. My stomach is in pain. Maybe she has food. With that, Ethan climbed the porch steps. Agnes's house had 2 rooms and a kitchen. The dim light that came through the dusty, faded curtains over grimy windows made it hard to see. The furniture was old, dark, and dusty. A dresser, table, a few stools, and a metal-framed bed in the main room. The second room had a lopsided wooden closet and a couch. The floorboards were wobbly, and it felt like they would give way and someone could fall through. Dust bunnies hid in the corners of the basement. Ethan looked around the basement. If Agnes's back weren't moving, he would think the house was empty. I don't clean, so I keep the windows shut. I don't need daylight, she said in a rough voice, as if she could read his mind. You mean you are blind? Ethan asked. Are you totally blind, or can you see a little? Totally blind, she replied. How do you live here by yourself? Does your family visit? I don't have any family. How do you get around? Metal is all around. I go by smell, she said, staring at him. Ethan felt a chill. Her blue eyes moved, but it was impossible to tell if she saw anything. A noise behind them made them jump. Turning around, Ethan saw Jake step inside. Granny, where can I wash up? He asked. Agnes led them to a bucket with a ladle and went back to her room. 5 minutes later, they followed. Sit at the table, she said, pointing to a simple meal. Their stomachs grumbled at the sight. They eagerly started eating. Miss Agnes, how far is the highway from here? Jake asked. It's quite far, she replied. You won't make it today, but maybe tomorrow. What does maybe mean? Ethan pressed. Just talking, she replied, staring at him again. It's still creepy. There are swamps everywhere, and that cemetery is close by. Don't you ever worry being blind? Jake asked. I have lived here my whole life and know every blade of grass. I'm too old to be afraid of graveyards. Agnes said, "Are you sleeping in my house or somewhere else?" "If it's okay, we'll stay here," Jake replied. "Then I'll set up the back room." A couple of hours later, the tired men were asleep. Ethan woke up in the middle of the night, really thirsty. Rising, he crept to the kitchen, trying not to startle the old woman as he passed her room. Her bed was empty. He looked around and realized she was gone. "Weird," he thought. "It's the middle of the night and she's not here. Maybe she went to the outhouse." In the kitchen, he filled a bowl with water from the bucket and drank it. Standing by the window, he almost dropped the ladle. There was someone sitting on the fence outside. No, it was Agnes, he was sure. She was crouched on a thin rail, her head moving from side to side. A large, bright moon lit the scene clearly. He could have described her outfit in great detail. Suddenly, she froze, as if she had sensed him. Her head began turning slowly. Her body remained still. Ethan felt fear. Her neck twisted further, turning completely. She stared at him with empty, hollow eyes. Ethan took a step back, staring at the window. Then he hit something. He turned around quickly and screamed. Agnes stood at the room's entrance, glaring silently. "What are you doing out at night?" she asked angrily. "I got up for water. Out there I saw," he started to say. "Saw what?" she interrupted. "Nothing," he faltered. "I thought I did. I'm going back." Ethan crawled into bed. His heart was beating very fast. Sweat formed on his forehead. He couldn't stop thinking about her twisted neck. He was restless and couldn't sleep. Jake woke up first. He left Ethan asleep and stepped out. Agnes sat at the table, sipping tea. "Ma'am, while he's out, I will scout around. Maybe I'll catch a signal." She didn't say anything. Outside, the early fall air felt refreshing. It was unusual for the season to have a warm breeze. At least the rain had stopped. Jake walked slowly, looking at the remaining houses, and soon he reached the end of the street. The forest stretched ahead. He checked his phone. There was no signal. He started to head back when he saw something moving near the woods. Squinting, he saw a young man waving. "You need to get out of this village now," the stranger said without any introduction. "What? Why? Who are you?" Jake asked. The man smiled. "Call me a local," he replied. "Local?" Jake repeated. "I don't understand. Nobody is here but Agnes." "She is exactly why you have got to run, as fast as you can. You might still be able to escape on your own." "What does might mean? I don't understand. We're not trapped. My friend will wake up soon and we'll leave by noon." "You don't understand," the guy insisted. "You won't believe me even if I explain. Follow me." He turned toward the cemetery. "Hey, wait," Jake called out, but the stranger disappeared into the trees. Jake was curious. Jake chased after him. Soon, they were at the cemetery. The man turned left and stopped. "See these fence scraps? They used to surround the whole place. Now, you can barely tell what is cemetery ground and what is not. Look, this stake is outside the fence. The person buried here could not rest on holy ground." Jake stood, not knowing what to do. "Why call it a stake? It's a broken cross." "No," the stranger said. "It is a stake, made of ash wood. Pick up that plaque next to it." Jake bent down and picked up a rusty tag. The year of birth was illegible. The death was before the war. Agnes Carver. "So what does that mean?" Jake asked. "It means the woman buried here is the Agnes you slept under last night." "What kind of joke is this? She died before the war, but the Agnes who took us in is alive and well, just blind." "She's blind for a reason," the stranger said. They gouged her eyes out before she died so she couldn't see who would kill her or curse them. "That's crazy," Jake shouted. "You're making this up to get a high. Where did you even come from?" Jake was furious. He had been lost in the woods for 2 days, and now he was back at the graveyard. "I'll be late getting to her house again. I'll be stuck there another night." Jake felt angry. The stranger's presence alone was infuriating. "I followed him like an idiot," he thought. "This damn forest. Ethan is probably up, waiting, and I am wasting time." His fists clenched. Then, suddenly startled, he rubbed his eyes and staggered back. The stranger moved forward without saying anything. Jake stopped when he hit a thick birch trunk. "Listen closely," the guy said. "When 2 girls disappeared in a month, the village lost it. They had searched for the girls, but nothing had been found. Then a ranger saw something bright floating in the swamp, a scarf from one of the girls' heads. People were sad and left, blaming the bogs. Months later, 2 more kids disappeared, and the villagers were very worried. Search parties scoured the swamps. They couldn't find anything. Parents stopped letting kids outside. One day, I was coming back from the next town over. It was late, so to avoid scaring every dog, I cut behind the houses. That's when I saw her. Agnes was carrying a big bag. It looked heavy. I was about to call out and offer to help when the sack moved. She snarled, "Stop squirming or I will eat you alive." I froze, waited until she left, then snuck into her place. The house was dark and quiet. I didn't know why I was there or what I would find, but something made me keep going. Then I heard a noise from the cellar. I found the trap door and opened it. In the dark, I found the 2 missing girls. They were starving and had tears on their faces, but they were alive. They screamed that Agnes was a monster who had locked them up. She had already taken 2 others to the graveyard and was planning to do the same to them. She said she would eat them to stay alive. What else could I do? Even if the kids were just pretending, I saw that bag move. I got them out, then ran to the cemetery. In the old crypt, I saw firelight. I looked inside, but I was too scared to go in. Agnes was stirring up a fire in the middle of the room. She was speaking under her breath and throwing things into the fire. 2 little girls were huddled in the corner. I didn't know what she planned, but I didn't wait. I ran in and yelled at the girls to run home. The first 2, who were hiding in the cellar, made it back to their parents and told them everything. Word spread, and a mob marched to the graveyard. It was too late for me, though. Agnes was furious. I later learned that it was not even her. A demon had taken over, craving sacrifices. The worst part? I became its meal in that crypt. I couldn't fight it. Since then, this forest and graveyard have become my prison. I can't leave. I saw it all that night. The mob grabbed her. She screamed, cursed, and swore she would come back. They cut out her eyes so she would never know who killed her, then burned and buried her outside the cemetery, like you do with witches. As for me, they buried me at the opposite end of the cemetery, he pointed. Jake understood. That is where I saw him, he thought. The blonde kid's photo on the monument. The stranger smiled, knowing what he was thinking. Yes, that is my picture. You and your friend saw me. My name is Nate. How do you know each other? Jake gasped. You're a ghost? How did she come back? What happened to the village? Did she wipe it out? No, Nate said, laughing. It's not that complicated. Her grave got overgrown, but the girls' folks I saved kept mine tidy. Then war hit. Men were drafted. Germans closed in. People scattered. The village emptied out. But the evil in her grave did not die. It waited. Wall scavengers showed up, digging up battlefields. They were her first. The evil has been waiting since then, stuck like me. It can't cross the cemetery. This sacred ground keeps it from moving forward. Grab your friend and run. Cut through the graveyard. She won't be able to follow you past that line. I'll show you back the way. Surprised, Jake hurried to the village. His head felt dizzy. He felt confused. All he wanted was to get out. When he arrived in the village, he carefully made his way to Agnes's house and looked through the window. There were thick curtains blocking most of the view, but there was a small gap that showed enough. That bad dream about the crypt came back. Through the curtain slit, he saw Ethan on the floor. Agnes was bent over him. Jake burst in and met Ethan's wide eyes. He was tied up, with his hands and feet tied up. Ethan had woken up to her face, which was twisted with rage and looming over him. He was too groggy to fight, and her unnatural strength pinned him down. Within a minute, he was tied up, and she crouched down and sniffed loudly. Jake shoved her hard. She crashed into a corner and went still. "Jake, what's happening?" Ethan said quickly. "That old lady went crazy. She's so strong. What's going on here?" Jake cut at the ropes. "We are leaving now," he said angrily. "I'll explain later. Just trust me. We're going to the graveyard." "The graveyard?" Ethan repeated. "That's near the swamp. We need the road." "Shut it, Ethan," Jake interrupted. "If you don't want to die, we have to go to the graveyard." Agnes stirred. They ran quickly to the forest, leaving everything behind. A deep, guttural howl echoed behind them. They ran even faster. They darted past trees, stopping and glancing back. There was no one following them. "Which way is right?" Ethan panted. "The swamp is that way," she said. A loud, mean cackle came from the village. Ethan and Jake ran through the woods without looking. They couldn't see a path to the cemetery. Behind them, the howls turned into growls. "She's messing with us, making us tired," Jake said, breathing heavily. "I don't understand. Who is she? What does she want?" "You won't believe this," Jake said. "They buried her almost 100 years ago. They blinded and burned her first." "What?" Ethan stared. "You'll believe even less how I know," Jake smirked. "He told me." Ethan gaped, not believing it. "Do not believe it? I didn't believe it either until I saw her with you. That dream? It was the same deal, except she was eating your guts." Twigs snapped behind them, and they ran again. Ethan stumbled. His foot sank into the muck of the swamp. Jake didn't notice and ran ahead. He turned around and found Ethan waist deep in the mud. "Come on, Ethan, one more pull," Jake urged, holding out a stick. "I can't, Jake, I'm done," Ethan said, sounding weak. His hands were shaking. Every attempt to escape the bog was unsuccessful. The forest went silent. There were no birds. There was no wind and no noise from the trees. "Come on, you are tired. Push," Jake begged. "I can't." Ethan looked at Jake. Turning, Jake saw Nate. "He is stuck," Jake said gently. "He's too weak." Nate stepped closer and pointed at the stick. "Hold on." He moved closer to Jake, like a shadow, and gave him his strength. Ethan grabbed the stick. With their combined pull, he fell to the ground, breathing heavily. "Move," Nate said, pointing to the cemetery, then disappeared. Jake saw something move behind Ethan. Agnes came out of the bushes, looking strange and smiling with her little teeth. Her empty sockets showed. She sniffed, lurching forward. They ran to the graveyard. Her howls which sounded rough, followed them. They could see crosses ahead. They hit hallowed ground as Agnes closed in, then stopped short, blocked by an invisible wall. They were lying on their backs, staring at her hideous face, pacing like a caged beast, sniffing the air. "She is sniffing for us," Ethan whispered. "How do we get out of here? She'll attack us as soon as we leave the graveyard." "We have to distract her," Jake said. "How, Jake?" "I'm not sure yet. She is blind. We'll use that to our advantage." "Right," Ethan agreed. "We'll go the other way." After watching her follow the fence line for 20 minutes, they made a plan. Ethan grabbed a rock. Jake tied his shirt around it. Ethan threw the rock. It snagged a branch, swaying like a pendulum. They held their breath. Agnes paused, her head tilted toward the rustling shirt. It worked. She started to walk away. They ran in the opposite direction. Nate waved them over in the middle of the cemetery. He led, helping them when they stumbled. Past the graveyard, they ran like mad. "Stop!" Nate called out to them. They stopped, panting. Their lungs burned. Their hearts were beating very fast. "This is our boundary," Nate said. "She and I cannot cross it. You wandered past it. People who do this cannot find their way back alone. I'm glad I got you out. I don't always manage it," he added sadly. "Go." "What about you?" Jake asked. "Back to her? Can we help?" Nate smiled. "Just don't come back here. Where there is eternal evil, something good has got to balance it. Goodbye." As dusk fell, Nate disappeared. They hurried off, hitting where they had entered 2 days ago. Their truck was there. The keys were lost at Agnes's. A car that passed them took them home. Days later, Jake woke up to a noise. In the dark, he saw Ethan's outline by the window. "Ethan, what's going on?" he whispered. It turned around. It wasn't Ethan, but Agnes's eyeless face. Jake woke up alone. The truck key lay on his nightstand, left in the forest. A howl sounded in the distance. In the mirror, the blonde kid from the photo pointed silently into the distance. The forest called to him again.